With the recent relaunch of Skepchick.org, I've started paying a little bit more attention to my old friends, the skeptics, and frankly, I've been horrified because they're the worst. Take an actual former friend of mine, Michael Shermer. Shermer actually helped launch Skepchick by letting me promote it in his email news blast for Skeptic Magazine, and we became friends shortly after that. But then shortly after that, I realized that he was a bad person. And then that was before I learned that someone accused him of raping her, with what I felt at the time was pretty compelling evidence behind it. And then he fell down the intellectual dark web IDW rabbit hole. And here we are today. As an aside, I still can't believe those dweebs called themselves the intellectual dark web. Like they're LARPing as cool people. Go back to 6th grade, you guys. Seriously. So this week, I learned that Michael Shermer, who once wrote an entire book about the dangers of Holocaust denial, tweeted about anti-fascists. Beating up a journalist because he criticizes your political ideology is what the Nazi Party did in Germany. Now it is happening in Portland, Oregon. Good to remember that Nazi equals National Socialism. Not far right, but far left. True liberalism opposes both. It's hard to say that this is the dumbest tweet of the year because Donald Trump is still on Twitter. The bar is just too high or too low, whatever. What we can say is that this is the dumbest tweet that Michael Shermer has sent this year. Of course, he did get ratioed hard. Hundreds of people showed up in his mentions to point out what an absolute moron he is. And eventually he did realize that they were right, that he is a moron, and he deleted his tweet. But let's talk about that tweet just a little bit, because it is something that he clearly believed. Most people focused on the Nazi equals far left part of his tweet, and for good reason. This is a popular talking point amongst far-right morons who all they know is that socialism is something the far left likes, and so National Socialism must be something the far left likes on a national scale. The same people point out that Lincoln was a Republican in 1861, so Republicans 150 years later can't possibly be racist. In the same vein, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea is a democratic republic, and the peanut is both a pea and a nut. So that's obviously a ridiculous statement to make. But what about the first part of his tweet? Beating up a journalist because he criticizes your political ideology is what the Nazi Party did in Germany. This is a reference to Andy Ngo, who writes for Quillette, which is the intellectual dark web's blog of record. He also is the guy who published that completely made-up study linking a list of journalists to Antifa, which led to white supremacist groups passing that article around and then making death threats against those journalists. Ngo also is the guy who wrote a misleading Wall Street Journal op-ed in which he slandered English Muslims. He might not consider himself a fascist, but he is quite obviously a useful idiot to fascists. So should people at this fascist rally have thrown milkshakes and silly string at him? Absolutely, in my opinion. But should someone have punched him in the face? Personally, I'm not a fan. I say, punch the actual Nazis with the swastikas shouting for a race war, milkshake the helpers. But it's tricky because this is one of those in-between cases, and they're the cases that really drive everybody nuts. Because it's easier for us to just throw our hands in the air and say, you know what? No violence ever is okay, or it's never okay to be mean to someone. And that might make it easier for law enforcement and for our own consciences, but is that the ethical decision? I'm not so sure. So no, I'm not on board with beating up Andy Ngo, but I do still take issue with the rest of Shermer's tweet. For a start, Ngo is not a journalist. Journalists investigate and report dispassionately. They do not randomly blog whatever fascist propaganda happens to cross their desk. There's a difference between a person who is attending an event to remain separate from it and dispassionately recording what is happening, and a man who foments hate against Muslims and black people on Twitter while crying nonstop about milkshakes, and then he goes and attends a fascist rally. Literally anyone today can start a blog and call themselves a journalist, but that doesn't make you one. You can't call yourself a journalist, do nothing but support fascists, and then be surprised when you show up to a fascist rally and get confused for a fascist. And my other concern is with the idea that Ngo was beaten up because he, quote, criticizes your political ideology, and that is, quote, what the Nazi party did in Germany. The Nazis systematically murdered people due to their religion and culture. And that's what the Nazis here are continuing to call for, aided by people like Ngo. It's a beautiful dream that we can defeat Nazis with pacifist ideals. And maybe we can, but it didn't work in the 1930s and the 1940s. And I'm not so sure it's going to work now. Fascism is dangerous because it uses the tools of liberalism against liberalism. Fascists hide behind the protection of absolute free speech in order to ultimately destroy it. They demand a stage so that they might then ultimately remove others from that stage, which they do right now by complaining nonstop about universities deplatforming Nazis, at the same time that they complain about professors discussing politics in the classroom. And it's incredibly simplistic to decide that we can't fight fascism head on because then we'll become the fascists. We will not become the fascists by driving fascists away. We would become fascists by marginalizing and ultimately destroying minorities based upon their skin color or their religion or their nation of origin or their sexuality. You know, the things that fascists kill people for. More than that, we would become the fascists by letting fascists gain a foothold in our society and by pretending that fascism is just another political ideology. It's not. When your political ideology is fascism, then yeah, there's a good case to be made for physical violence in response to it. It's what our grandparents and our great-grandparents had to do to snuff it out. They tried to use liberal tactics, and the result was that 6 million Jews were murdered. The problem is, at what point do we employ that violence? If we could all go back in time and kill all the Nazis before 6 million Jews died, would we? We don't have the benefit of that retrospect in the present day. We don't have that clarity of knowing who the bad guy is and what is required to stop him. So if we can prevent the next fascist government from taking hold, and if we can do it by physical intimidation but not grievous bodily harm, should we try? Because for all the cries about Antifa violence, their body count remains 0. They haven't killed a single fascist, while still managing to make fascists afraid. Meanwhile, the fascists have murdered anti-fascists, Muslims, Jews, and women at an alarming rate. I don't have all the answers on the morality of violence against fascism, but I do know that when it comes to fascists versus anti-fascists, those of us on the side of progressive democracy have more reason to be afraid than getting hit with a milkshake. I'll conclude by pointing to one of Shermer's desperate follow-up tweets in which he attempts to still be seen as a vaguely serious and intellectual person. He tweets that his problem with Antifa and the violent fascist groups they oppose is violence doesn't work to achieve political goals as well as nonviolent protest/civil resistance, as evidenced by Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephen in their data. Here's that chart. 2 points about it. First of all, there was a time in history when, according to this very data set, violent protests were more effective than nonviolent protests. That was in the 1940s. What was happening in the 1940s? Oh yeah, Nazis. The second point is that these researchers labeled any campaign as nonviolent if it had fewer than 100 combat deaths. Considering that Antifa is currently at 0 deaths, and considering that violent resistance was more effective when Nazis were at their peak, All Shermer has actually done here is argued that for Antifa to be more effective, they should be more violent. Good job, Shermer. I'm sure that people are prouder than ever to call themselves skeptics.